pollution is not killing the Chesapeake Bay. Politics is killing the Chesapeake Bay because it allows pollution to go on unfettered, unrestricted in a way that the Chesapeake cannot tolerate, which is the central premise of my work for the last 7 years. Here's the problem, and it's a human problem. It's the problem that repeats itself around the globe, and it goes like this. Human beings have knowledge of their own mortality. We're going to die, and we know about it. Coupled with the race to improve ourselves in the very short period of time that we're given, and our ability to relatively easily escape the environmental impact of our short lives. These three things combine to create what I discuss commonly as a renter's mentality. And we all know what the renter's mentality is. The renter's mentality puts a premium on short-term economic benefits. It works against long-term capital investments. It makes it difficult to plan for the future. Quite simply, it leads people to seek the highest possible benefit from a piece of land at the least possible cost. We all know what the renter's mentality is, and given a choice to live in a community of renters or to live in a community of owners, we would choose to live among the owners, but we're not afforded that choice. Here's the point. The role of government as it relates to environmental protection is to create the necessary incentives and punishments, the carrots and sticks, that motivate people and industries to live as if they would live forever on the land that they currently occupy. To help people overcome this renter's mentality that's inherent in our own ephemeral existence and adverse to environmental conditions everywhere. A properly functioning environmental bureaucracy is the property manager that nobody likes, but that we all need. And our challenge is to assure that government functions as a wise steward rather than a greedy slumlord. Properly understood, the Chesapeake Bay's current environmental problems represent an irreconcilable conflict between competing values. Those with the values of what I would call greens, and those with the values of renters, or what others would call cornucopians. The greens, regardless of their shade, quite simply believe that the Chesapeake Bay and the larger environment that sustains it is worth the cost of restoration and protection. The cornucopians, or the renters, benefit from exploiting the bay in one way or another, exploiting it as a cheap and convenient place to dispose of our unwanted byproducts, what economists and political scientists would call externalities, agricultural runoff, industrial waste, air pollution, sewage, whatever the externality is, or exploiting it by over-harvesting its limited resources in a process known as the tragedy of the commons. And it's not that those with the renter's mentality and the cornucopians are evil or ignorant. They're not. Acting like a cornucopian is often rational from a business perspective. Business leaders aim to minimize production costs so as to maximize profits. That's their job, that's their responsibility, and that's what motivates them. Taking steps to control externalities inevitably increases short-term production costs, threatens profits, and if done unilaterally, can make a bay-friendly or environmentally friendly business uncompetitive in the larger market. If environmental programs were cheap, or if they were profitable, they wouldn't be controversial and we'd already be doing them. And no amount of environmental education, no amount of science, no amount of wishful thinking can overcome this fact and the numerous conflicts, the innumerable conflicts that this spawns. Restoration is a continuous struggle to change human behavior, and there is nothing more unpopular than that. To force people and industries to take actions they would otherwise not take, to make them act like owners. Our government, with its monopoly on coercive powers and its considerable resources, can make sure that the short-term economic interests of the few do not destroy the collective long-term interests of the whole. And only government can make sure that the necessary rules are equitably enforced so that environmentally friendly businesses are not put at a competitive disadvantage for taking action. And as a fellow freedom lover, I might add, I didn't come to those conclusions happily. I'm not in favor of big government or onerous regulations, but the fact of the matter is, when it comes to environmental protection, there's no other game in town. This is a political problem. It's the problem of achieving collectively what we cannot and will not achieve as individuals. It's the process of protecting societal values from the onslaught of private interests. The defining question of our time, the one that we're going to be thinking about for a long time after the war on terror or the war on anything, is whether or not we, you and me, have a right, a human right, to clean air, clean water, and vibrant natural resources in our public spaces. In which case, if we do, our government has a responsibility to protect those things, even if it's expensive and even if it's inconvenient, because it will be expensive and it is inconvenient, and so has every meaningful thing that our government has ever done. The central question that haunts my research, not just this book, but all of my environmental policy research related to the Bay, goes like this. Given the tremendous amount of support that the Chesapeake Bay has in the general public, 40 years of environmental education programs, given the level of support the Bay has among our region's leading elected officials, they all support the Bay, just ask them, and they'll all be campaigning in favor of the Bay come 2010. Given the impressive scientific advances that we've made in the last 30 years, it's often said that we know more about the Chesapeake Bay than any other body of water on the face of the earth. Given the phenomenal wealth of this region, it's as wealthy as any other place on earth. Why is it that the restoration has been such a failure? And think about it. If we fail here in the Chesapeake, where we have an environmental commitment from the public, where our elected officials swear an oath to preserve the Chesapeake Bay, where the science is good, and where we have all the money. If we fail here, where are we going to succeed? Where the commitment is less, where the science is less, where we've had less environmental education? I'm not sure. And we have to get our hands around the extent to which this has been a colossal failure, a phenomenal failure, one of the largest failures in humankind. It happened to have unfolded in slow motion, but it's a failure nonetheless. And here are some numbers just to make the point. Right now, oyster harvests are at record lows, less than 1% of historic norms. The crab population teeters at the point of collapse. Watermen in the Chesapeake Bay are receiving disaster relief money, otherwise known as welfare payments, in order to sustain them to lay off the crabs. Contaminants have been found in every fish tested by authorities. Raw sewage flows into the bay from outdated sewage systems that are designed to overflow into the bay. Nutrient pollution, sediment plumes, toxic algae outbreaks, and low oxygen levels continue to plague the Chesapeake Bay. And the Chesapeake Bay and every one of its tributaries are currently listed on the EPA's list of impaired bodies of water, some 39 years after the Clean Water Act. But all of that doesn't mean much to the general public. So I did an experiment this summer. The experiment went like this. There's a woman in our local community college. Her name is Sally Horner. And she tests the water quality up and down the river in the Chesapeake where I live. And I asked her, she does it on Thursday, and I said, Sally, if I bring you some water samples on Thursday, will you test them along with the samples you take from the river? And she said, sure. And so she came and she gave her samples, and I gave her 3 additional samples. And I didn't tell her what they were. She went back to her lab and tested them. What she didn't know is that the first sample was from my toilet, not so clean toilet. My second sample was from my toilet that had feces in it. My third sample was from my toilet that has feces in it that sat there for an hour, that I swirled around a little bit so there would be no excuses. It was absolutely disgusting. She came back with her results, and the average bacterial levels in those water samples were lower than the average for the river that week, and they were all within the acceptable swimming limits according to the EPA. Think about that. That is the state of the Chesapeake Bay today. Can you imagine if somebody defecated in the swimming pool here? People would run out of the building like it was on fire. It would be terrible. Or if your fellow parents, when your children has an accident in the bathtub, the reaction that you have. Now imagine going and putting your face in a toilet where there is feces and flushing it and swirling it around, and that's the equivalent of swimming in the Severn River in the Chesapeake Bay under most conditions. Okay? So we don't need to know about 2% historic norms. We don't need to know about eutrophication and nutrient loading. The bay is gross. After 30, 40 years of fighting for the bay is disgusting. So what happened? To answer that question, you have to think about environmental thought for a while. And I do this in the book, and I want to do it once again for you today. So I'm going to try to go to my next slide. So here's my next slide. This book is a summary of, this graphic is a summary of one chapter in the book. And what I do is I start on the far left, and I talk about this cornucopian, this non-environmental way of thinking, and I move my way to the right. If I had been smarter, I would have put the cornucopians on the right and moved to the left, but I'm not so smart. So here we go. Let's start with the conservatives, or the cornucopians, or the non-greens. What is the value that they place on nature? And what does that mean for the way they advocate for what they believe in? Well, their primary value of nature is its economic value. The value of nature is the services that it provides to industry, the raw materials, the land, the convenient place to dispose of unwanted byproducts. And what are their policy preferences? Well, they're all too familiar. They believe that when the government does anything at all, that environmental protection should be done as a cost-benefit analysis. That if the cost of restoration is greater than the thing that you're protecting's value, you simply don't do it. They believe in a laissez-faire approach. They believe that free markets, if given a chance, will provide what the government promises but rarely delivers. They believe that government environmental programs are bad for business because government environmental programs are bad for business in the short run. They worship at the altar of private property, and their holy trinity is that of free markets, economic growth, and technology. They believe that we can grow ourselves green, and that countries go through dirty periods, but ultimately clean up their acts in time as their economies grow, and they ask you simply to be patient, and we will get through this mess sooner or later. One step down on our chart, you have what I refer to as the light greens. The light greens have a different value of nature. They believe in its monetary value, but they also believe that nature has a recreational value, that it provides value to people as simply as a playground. They believe in hunting, fishing, sailing, hiking, swimming, and that those values of nature are worth something and should be protected. They also believe that nature has a cultural value, that nature provides an environment that sustains rich cultures, like Smith Island on the Chesapeake Bay, or Tangier Island, or Rock Hall, or whatever it might be. And that when you diminish those environmental conditions, you're not simply diminishing the bay, you're hurting cultures, precious cultures that are irreplaceable. For this group, their policy goals are straightforward. They are the conservationists. They want to extend practical policies to the current generation. They want to conserve our resources so that they're used wisely. They believe in voluntary collaborative partnerships, management structures that seek to achieve common ground, win-win policies among all the stakeholders. Environmental education and research are very important to this group. They believe that we should provide financial incentives to industry to stop their polluting ways. Collectively known, they believe in the public pays approach, providing money, resources to polluting industries so that they will change their ways. One step farther, we have the greens. The greens have yet another value of nature, different than the cornucopians and even the light greens. They believe that the value of environmental protection is a right, that it is a human right. They believe in this concept of environmental justice that suggests all people, regardless of their economic status, have a basic right to clean air, clean water, and vibrant natural resources, and that no person or no industry, regardless of how wealthy they are or how powerful they are, has a right to diminish those things for human beings. But they also believe in this value, human value for future generations. The notion that environmental rights, clean air, clean water, and vibrant natural resources extend beyond those people living on Earth today. In other words, a person's property rights are limited by the impact that they have on people and future generations, so say the Greens. Their policy preferences are relatively straightforward. They want to establish limits, boundaries that are set by science on what polluting industries and polluting individuals can do. They want to establish these in the least disruptive manner. They would be in favor of things like cap and trade and so on. They don't want to harm industry, but they do want industry to live within certain natural bounds. Now we're going to go one step farther. This is when it starts to get exciting. Now we get into the dark greens, one of my favorites. We're going to have a dark green awakening here, hopefully. What is the value for the dark greens of nature? Well, they have a value that goes beyond that of the greens. They believe that nature has a spiritual value. They believe in a traditional 19th century transcendental philosophy that nature has spiritual, feeds us spiritually, that we get spiritual sustenance from experiencing nature firsthand. They believe that human beings are tied into a web of connection with nature, and that the distinction between man and nature is artificial and detrimental to both man and nature. Their policy preferences is different than the Greens, the light greens, and certainly the cornucopians. They are the preservationists. They want to protect the sanctity of nature by placing large swaths of nature off limits for human exploitation, to create green cathedrals. And they believe in the importance of wilderness for wilderness sakes. They establish these sacred places. They think that polluting our sacred rivers is no less and no different than urinating in a baptismal font or using the American flag as toilet paper. It's no different for them. They believe so strongly. And they don't believe in this public pays approach of the Greens. They reject that. They believe in the polluter pays approach, that those people that create waste, that create harm, should be responsible for cleaning it up. And if it's expensive, so be it. If it puts some people out of business, so be it. They also believe that price is not an issue. They believe that the necessary policies need to be put in place, even if they're expensive and even if they're inconvenient. And they remind us that other great achievements of our government were expensive and inconvenient, whether it was freeing slaves or stopping child labor or whatever it might have been. Now we get to go farther. Now we get to go to what I call the Reds. They are the radical animal rights groups and people. Their value of nature is different than all of these other groups, and it's not different in degree, it's different in kind. They are as different from the dark greens as the greens are from the cornucopians. They believe that nature has intrinsic value that's separate from the services that nature provides human beings. They are not anthropocentric, they are biocentric. It's fundamentally different. They believe that animals have rights that were once reserved exclusively for human beings. They believe that animals should be humanely treated. They should not be eaten. They should not be exploited or abused in any way. They believe that there is a problem on the earth, and it is essentially a human problem. That we, Western society, and our consumption habits are a virus that's spreading around the globe and essentially destroying it. And they are at war against pollution in a very real and a very significant way. Their policy preferences are different than all the other greens. They want a radical transformation of our economy and our political system that would support animal welfare and real sustainable living. Their radical goals do not allow them to use traditional policy methods. Writing letters and lobbying and petitioning are not the tools of the Reds. Their liberal leanings, however, do not allow them to use conventional violence. Their goal is transformation, not destruction. Theirs is a nonviolent revolution. But they don't mind destroying a little property along the way. So their tactics include things like ecotage, or what Edward Abbey discussed in his book Monkey Wrenching as monkey wrenching. It might include something like cutting down billboards in scenic locations. It might include tree sitting in a location where a college or university might clear trees to add a new building, and they might take root in those trees to prevent that. It might be hanging a banner on a dam that has a big crack, signifying that this dam is a danger to people downstream. It could be liberating animals from research labs, or even going farther and burning SUV dealers, or burning developments in critical habitat, which has so often been the case. While these participants are not afraid to use tactics that destroy property and break the law, they are not generally considered eco-terrorists, as their tactics do not target human beings. All right, so there's our spectrum. Here's the problem for the Greens. The cornucopians speak with a unified voice, and the environmental community is divided against itself in what I discuss as a dysfunctional coalition. And anybody who's been active in environmental groups like myself know the dysfunctionality of environmental groups. You have the greens, the light greens, the dark greens, and the reds, all talking past each other, all defining themselves as not being the other groups, and all condemning the tactics of their competing groups. For example, the reds aren't simply frustrated dark greens. The reds have no patience whatsoever for the greens, whether they be light or dark. They believe that all greens exist in a hopeless haze of hypocrisy. They insist that mainstream green thinking ignores the most pressing environmental concerns of our time, which are an economic system that relies on the myth of endless growth and a never-ending supply of dirty fossil fuels. They also believe that these light greens support a human population that cannot control its own growth, never mind curb its consumption habits. They believe that the greens are providing humanity small solutions to big problems, and in doing so are distracting us from the severity of the situation and the magnitude of the change that's necessary. They believe that Greens' conventional tactics are not up to the challenge at hand. So here are some examples of them. This is one of my favorite. This is a fellow that spent 21 months living in that tree. This is University of California, Berkeley. The student was protesting the college that was going to expand their recreational facilities, I believe a stadium, into this wooded area. And he lived up there, and he would still be up there if the college hadn't encircled his tree encampment with a fence, and they would shine lights on him at night to distract him. They would play music, they would do everything they could, but it did take him 21 months, and he did delay those activities. Here's another one, my favorite red environmental group. This is the Sea Shepherds, made famous by the new Animal Planet show, Whale Wars. And so here they are throwing butyric acid, which is really nothing more than rancid butter. They're throwing it at the Japanese whaling fleet, which pretends to be doing research while they go out and harvest 1,000 minke whales every year. And I always like to say this because I go from the Naval Academy and everybody thinks I teach a bunch of mindless conservative students. One of my Naval Academy graduates is now a crew member of the Sea Shepherds, Jane Taylor, class of 2003, the Naval Academy. And if you watch Whale Wars, she's the one that actually drives the ship and keeps Paul Watson from completely destroying the boat. Here's a classic example. A lot of people say that this was the event that turned the tide against from environmental reds. This happened in 1998. This was an act of arson by the Earth Liberation Front. They burnt a ski lodge in Vail, Colorado. The ski lodge was being built in an endangered habitat of the endangered lynx, and they protested by burning this thing down. It cost $12 million in damage, and it brought them what they thought would be a lot of positive attention, and it turned out to be significantly negative attention. All right, I'm going to leave that up for a second. It's kind of pretty. The dark greens. While the dark greens are not willing to go as far as the reds, the dark greens reject the approach of the light greens. The dark greens insist that environmental advocacy has to move beyond environmental education and moral arm twisting, which are the primary tools of those light greens. They insist that the environmental community has to use every legal tool at their disposal, which means litigation, which means lobbying, which means endorsing candidates, advertising the voting records of not-so-green candidates, and engaging in the political process to the full extent, including acts of civil disobedience that don't damage property. Their model for action is Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 1950s. They have a sense of urgency and outrage that the light greens don't have. The dark greens are not interested in compromise, and they deeply, deeply resent those light greens that are willing to compromise away what the dark greens think are their basic environmental rights. The dark greens remind us that it was their approach, not the light greens, that gave us the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, and created the Environmental Protection Agency. The dark greens also resent the antics of the reds, which they believe cast all environmental advocates in a negative light and ultimately undermines the public support that the environmental community so desperately needs. So here are my examples of our dark greens. So here's a fellow running for Congress, and he's getting his Sierra Club endorsement. This fellow was in the Lehigh Valley, typical dark green activity. Another dark green group, one of my favorites, is Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s Riverkeeper group. Was founded to protect the Hudson River. It's now been expanded up and down the East Coast and is going west, essentially putting people on rivers and suing polluters as necessary. One of my all-time favorites, the NRDC, the National Resources Defense Council. I like them because they have 300 attorneys and they love to sue people in defending your environmental rights. So I'll leave them up there for a second to give them a plug. Let's talk about our light greens. The light greens resent the pretentious, greener-than-thou attitudes of the dark greens, and quite frankly, they fear the reds. The light greens insist that laws alone are insufficient to bring about the changes that we need. The light greens remind us that laws require public acceptance, buy-in from the business community, and enforcement from government agencies. The light greens insist that they are not trying to undermine the advances of the previous generation or the dark greens, but build on them by increasing public awareness and building political will. The one area in which the light greens and dark greens agree is that there is no place for the lawless approach of the reds, which they believe undermines mainstream environmental thinking. So I'll give you my light green groups. Remember Ranger Rick? How many of you were in a dentist office as a kid reading Ranger Rick? There you go, okay? That's where I got my environmental ethics scared out of my mind before the dentist, desperately going through Ranger Rick. Ranger Rick is published by the National Wildlife Federation and in a group that has hundreds of millions of dollars in resources and educates school kids and adults alike. Here's another light green group that I'm fond of criticizing, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, which is highly active in my region, a group that brings in about $30 million a year, has 110,000 dues-paying members, and engages in significant environmental education programs throughout the Chesapeake Bay. All right, so what are the consequences of this dysfunctional coalition? Here they are. Despite the fact that environmentalism is now mainstream thinking, the environmental community is divided in its tactics and relatively ineffective in its results. The light greens prefer not to confront the cornucopians. The light greens preference is always to work with their business partners and to seek common ground through voluntary partnerships. The dark greens see no point in such partnerships, and they seek binding rules and regulations that will limit the destructive policies and practices of the cornucopians. The reds, on the other hand, see modern Western society as working within the unspoken cornucopian paradigm and focus their energy on fostering a societal transformation. Again, they talk past each other and they don't work together. The minority view, which is the cornucopian view, often prevails not just because the environmental community is divided and dysfunctional. It's not that simple. The cornucopians are highly effective at what they do. They're good at what they do. The cornucopians masterfully sell their minority message in a way that resonates with many Americans and most politicians. Cornucopians have increasingly been successful in depicting all environmentalists, regardless of their color, as closet socialists, as socialists that want to increase the scope of government, raise your taxes, and bring socialism to the shores of America, using environmental protection as an excuse for their larger aims, which is this somewhat socialist paradigm. The cornucopians have also masterfully blurred the distinction between the different types of environmental groups. At the very best, they cast environmentalists as Malthusian pessimists that say the sky is falling, the world is going to come to an end, there will be no more fish, global warming is going to have us all frying eggs in January in a matter of months, and they cast environmentalists as irrational doomsdayers. More often, they depict them as radical animal rights extremists. For them, that's the cornucopians, the lawless reds come to represent all environmental thinking. So anybody who's an environmentalist is now cast in the same group as animal rights extremists. They capitalize on the public's trust of the hidden hand of markets and the magical power of technology. As Americans, we believe in free markets without question, and we also believe in technology, and the cornucopians capitalize on this. They also capitalize on our basic distrust of government. For some reason in this country, government policies are seen as a failure and not as our collective success. And they know that, and they work that issue relentlessly. They also feed on America's hopeless optimism, otherwise known as the American dream. This idea that we can have each passing generation be wealthier, happier, and healthier than the last one, and that there is no limit to our growth or our prosperity. The majority, but dysfunctional environmental community has failed to make the case against the cornucopians. Quite simply, they're losing the war of ideas. They have failed to explain basic ideas such as, should the entire undeveloped world go through its dirty period that the cornucopians talk about, that the consequences would be devastating for our planet. That the world cannot sustain a global population that adopts the consumption habits of the West. Period. Fact. Not arguable. That developed nations, even with their advanced technologies and efficient markets, have not solved their pollution problems. The environmental community has failed to make that case. That is, we, the industrialized, wealthy nations, still have air pollution problems, water pollution problems, not to mention our carbon emission problems and our toxins. Developed nations have not solved their pollution problems. We exported them to the third or developing world. And we consume the bulk of the world's limited resources. The environmental community has failed to articulate the idea that the environmental gains that we have made were achieved in developed nations not solely because our economies grew, as the cornucopians would have us believe. Environmental gains were achieved when developed nations adopted environmental regulations, all of which the cornucopians opposed. What does this all mean? Well, does it mean that environmental protection is impossible? The answer is absolutely positively no. Does it mean that the environmental community is hopelessly lost? Maybe. No, it doesn't mean that at all. Don't take that away. What it means is that those who want unfettered markets and environmental protection desire something that never was and likely never can be. In other words, the cornucopian argument quite simply is weak. It's flawed, and it's the responsibility of the Greens and the Reds and common sense Americans to come to terms with this. It also means that environmental advocates must spend less time and energy bickering among themselves and more time and energy on their common desires, respecting their disparate functions. The light greens, the dark greens, and the reds have a role to play in environmental protection. At the end of the day, the goal is to change the political course of least resistance, and this requires the entire environmental community. The course of least resistance right now is for elected officials to pay lip service to the environment while providing the tangible demands of corporations and major polluters. The environmental community has a responsibility to change that, to make sure that a politician who cares about absolutely nothing but re-election votes the right way on the environment because it's in their political interest. That's not the case right now, but if that were to happen, we would have a fundamentally different situation than we have. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions, and I will talk about the Chesapeake Bay Caption also.